Hello， 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。Washington is in a panic after tech giant Huawei released a phone that appears to show China has got around the US's aggressive attempts to stymie Chinese technological progress with the new Mate 60 Pro. The Washington Post, usually a pretty good barometer of the sentiment on Capitol Hill, opined, "New phone sparks worry China has found a way around US's tech limits," which one analyst described as a slap in the face to Washington. Much deserved, I say. Today, I'll break the situation down in layman's terms, and we'll also catch up with US geopolitical analyst Thomas Pauken the Second. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. First up, a quick apology for the lack of content recently. I've been overseas in Laos filming a pretty massive short documentary on the new China to Laos railway. The finished film is 22 minutes long, which requires quite a lot of my energy editing and so on, which has meant I haven't really had much time to film reports on China. But good news, the process is mostly done and landlocked, the railway to Laos, will most likely be released next week. Here's a quick sneak peek. Hey you guys, I'm here in Vientiane, which is the capital city of Laos. But my journey began more than 1,000 kilometers away when I hopped on board the brand new China to Laos railway in Kunming, Yunnan province. During my journey, I've met a woman who is trying her best to turn a small border town into a city you guys will all know in the future. I also met a local who learned how to build railways in China, and a man who devotes his life to dealing with the aftermath of thousands upon thousands of unexploded bombs left all across this beautiful country by the USA. I'm Andy Boreham here in Vientiane, Laos. This is a special edition of Reports on China. Okay, now back to the topic at hand. Chinese phone maker Huawei last week announced the release of an extremely symbolic new phone, the Mate 60 Pro, which is said to contain completely Chinese-made technology that Washington was trying to stop it from attaining with crippling sanctions. Because of China's technological success and Huawei's rise to one of the world's top communications manufacturers, the US, which still has draconian control over global trade and is absolutely terrified of losing its position at the top of the pecking order, created sanctions that stopped China purchasing the latest computer chips. The first sanctions were introduced 4 years ago and basically stopped China being able to produce the latest 5G phones, among other things. Instead, China could only buy older chips and could only make 4G devices. It's worth noting that before the sanctions, China was happy buying the latest chips from global producers, many of whom are US companies. Those companies and many tech experts were worried then that China would be forced to turn inwards and create its own chips as a way to stay alive. Washington, knowing only brute force and aggressive suppression tactics, ignored those concerns and bet that China would never be able to catch up in any real way. Last week, their bets appear to have been proven completely wrong when Huawei made the ultimate move by announcing their new phone, the Mate 60 Pro, the day US Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, one of the chief architects of those hideous sanctions against China, was making her official visit to Beijing. So why is the Mate 60 Pro so groundbreaking? Well, according to preliminary reports, it contains a completely Chinese-made 7-nanometer chip, something no one expected could be produced in China so quickly. Let's read that Washington Post report again, especially the headline, which says it all. New phone sparks worry China has found a way around US tech limits. The article says, the Mate 60 Pro's launch has sparked hushed concern in Washington that US sanctions have failed to prevent China from making a key technological advance. Such a development would seem to fulfill warnings from US chip makers that sanctions would not stop China, but would spur it to redouble efforts to build alternatives to US technology. They went on to quote Paul Triolo from Washington-based business consulting firm Albright Stonebridge Group as calling the new phone a major blow to all of Huawei's former technology suppliers, mostly US companies. So what is a 7-nanometer chip and why is the US worried that China can now produce them? The nanometer reference here refers to the chip's size, with the smaller the number representing the latest tech. For reference, a piece of paper is 100,000 nanometers thick. Tech companies are currently racing to produce smaller chips, which requires special machinery that cannot be sold to China because of Washington's hideous sanctions, which are basically just their way of gatekeeping technology to stay on top. An extremely undemocratic and violent strategy, if you ask me. China's ability to produce 7-nanometer chips now shows that it has somehow indigenously created the process to do so many, many years faster than Washington or anyone else predicted. To be fair, 7-nanometer chips are not the current best technology, with 4-nanometer chips inside the latest iPhones, for example, and chips as thin as 3 nanometers expected in the new iPhone, which is set to launch soon. But in this case, size really does not matter because it's enough to show that China is well on its way to skirting US sanctions and becoming more self-reliant, which, by the way, is exactly what the rest of the world, including the US, constantly say they do not want. Anytime China resorts to relying more on itself and not its global partners, the West cries out and accuses Beijing of not being a good global citizen and not playing by the rules of the so-called international rules-based order. But that is just gaslighting. China was more than happy before the US installed crippling tech sanctions to buy key components from foreign and even US suppliers. Washington had hoped China would just bow down and stop competing, but that was a seriously terrible judgment, and the Washington elite will live to regret it, clearly. Now that China has been forced to create its own indigenous components, the US and its allies are rightly worried that pretty soon they will not be able to compete, sending them crashing down from their spot at the top, even faster than if they had just played fair and not booted China out. Okay, now I want to bring in US geopolitical analyst Thomas Pauken the Second. Thomas, good to have you on the show again. I'm really keen to get your opinion on this apparent new breakthrough in Chinese technology. Do you think that the current worry from the US is well placed, or is the US-led monopoly on chip technology still rock solid?
The US-led monopoly on chip technology is definitely not rock solid. And if the US thought they could keep it by blocking China from developing its chips industry, it totally backfired, and Huawei is showing how it failed. Basically, what we're witnessing is China overcoming these blocks from the US and other Western powers to create and localize its chips manufacturing and semiconductor industries. And also, China is going to move forward in a fast-forward fashion well ahead in the next few years ahead, and it's actually going to cause more problems to the U.S. economy and U.S. high-tech industry in the long term.
So do you feel that China's apparent breakthrough might in any way lead to Washington maybe realizing that these sanctions won't work, or are they just completely unaware where this is heading?
They are definitely unaware. The problem with the U.S. is that they constantly support this concept of economic sanctions on other countries they don't like or on other people they don't like, and somehow they think that people will just buckle under and somehow surrender to the U.S. sanctions regimes. However, what we are witnessing in recent times is the exact opposite, is that people are now strongly against the sanctions because they realize that even if they support Washington right now, they may become victims of sanctions later. So what China is doing is showing that they can become more independent, and by blocking the chips and semiconductor mergers with the U.S., what China is simply doing is creating its own new technologies right now.
So what do you think we can expect to see in the future in this space then?
Well, basically, anticipate that there's going to be a long-term decline in the US as well as European high-tech manufacturing industry, simply because what they're doing is blocking China, and China now has no choice but to innovate on its own and develop its own research and development, R&D. And so the US thinking that they could have defeated China will in actuality hurt themselves, because basically they've thought with the blocks they don't need to improve their R&D development. So they're gonna fall behind China's technology progress.
Definitely worth watching in the future. Thomas, good to see you as always. And that will be it for today, you guys. But as usual, I would love to know what you think. Do let me know down below. Will China eventually overtake the US in chip technology? And will Washington have a massive rethink about its sanction warfare? Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.